If you think T-Rex was the undisputed king of the late Cretaceous, untouchable, unrivaled, the top of every food chain it ever walked into, you'd be wrong. There was something else sharing that world, something that never had to touch the ground to be dangerous, and it may have looked at a small or juvenile tyrannosaur the same way a hawk looks at a rabbit. Its name was Quetzalcoatlus, and it remains, to this day, the largest flying animal ever confirmed to have existed on planet Earth. Start with the numbers. Quetzalcoatlus had a wingspan estimated at somewhere between 33 and 36 feet, roughly the wingspan of an F-16 fighter jet. Standing on the ground, folded up on all fours the way researchers now believe it moved, it stood as tall as a giraffe, somewhere between 16 and 18 feet at the shoulder. And despite all of that size, it's estimated to have weighed only around 200 to 250 kilograms, somewhere in the range of 440 to 550 pounds, a fraction of what you'd expect from something built on that scale. Something the height of a giraffe, with the wingspan of a fighter jet weighing about as much as a large motorcycle. The only reason that math works out at all is bone structure. Like birds today, its skeleton was riddled with hollow, air-filled bones, incredibly strong for their weight, but almost unsettlingly light for their size. Nature had already solved the how do you fly if you're enormous problem, millions of years before humans ever built an aircraft to do the same thing artificially. Its name comes from Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god of Aztec mythology, a fitting name for something that must have looked less like an animal and more like a myth, drifting across the sky of prehistoric Texas, where most of its known fossils have actually been found. Here's where things get genuinely unsettling though, because Quetzalcoatlus wasn't some passive, harmless glider drifting along on wind currents, waiting for something to already be dead. For a long time, that's exactly what scientists assumed. The image of giant pterosaurs as prehistoric vultures soaring high above the landscape scanning for carcasses feels intuitive. It also turns out to be mostly wrong. Research led by paleontologist Mark Witton at the University of Portsmouth found that the overwhelming majority of large pterosaur fossils, Quetzalcoatlus included, turn up on land, not near ancient coastlines or open water the way you'd expect from an animal built primarily to scavenge or fish. Witton's conclusion, based on that pattern, was blunt. Flight for an animal like this was mostly just transportation. The actual hunting happened on the ground, on foot, most of the time. When it landed, it folded its enormous wings and walked on all fours, using its wings almost like a second pair of front legs, the same way modern vampire bats awkwardly but effectively move on the ground today. That quadrupedal stance also came in handy on unstable terrain, cliffs, steep banks, uneven ground, where a four-limbed grip offered far more stability than trying to balance on two legs alone. Once on foot, it would have wandered around lakes, floodplains, and open ground, hunting for anything small enough to fit down that enormous throat, fish, amphibians, small reptiles, and yes, based on current size estimates, potentially small dinosaurs too, including juveniles of species that would have grown into far larger, far more dangerous adults. A young tyrannosaur, not yet grown into the apex predator it would eventually become, may have been well within range for something built on this scale. Picture the scale difference for a second. A newly hatched or juvenile tyrannosaur, still small, still vulnerable, still years away from the bone-crushing bite force that made its species famous, wandering across an open floodplain in search of its own meal. Meanwhile, standing at giraffe height nearby or descending silently from several thousand meters up is something with a beak longer than a baseball bat and a body built specifically to close the distance fast. It's a genuinely strange reversal of the food chain most people picture when they think about the late Cretaceous, where the animal usually cast as the ultimate predator may, at certain points in its life, have needed to watch the sky just as carefully as anything else living in that ecosystem. The weapon doing most of that work wasn't claws or teeth, because Quetzalcoatlus, like all pterosaurs in its family, didn't have any teeth at all. Instead, it had an enormous, rigid, spear-like beak, estimated at over 2.5 feet long on its own, longer in proportion than the jaw of almost any other known animal. Toothless, but far from harmless, shaped more like an oversized pair of tweezers than a typical predator's mouth, precise enough to snatch small, fast-moving prey, but strong enough to handle something with real size and struggle behind it. Some researchers have also pointed to a sieve-like structure along the lower jaw, a feature that may have let Quetzalcoatlus filter small prey directly out of shallow water, similar in basic concept to how some modern wading birds feed today, sweeping the beak through water and mud and catching anything too small or too slow to escape in time. Then there's the part of this story that sounds almost too dramatic to be real: how something this size ever got into the air in the first place. Paleontologist Sankar Chatterjee, working at Texas Tech University, built computer models specifically to answer that question, because on paper, an animal this heavy, with wings this thin and fragile looking, shouldn't reasonably be able to fly at all. What Chatterjee's models revealed was a launch method almost nothing alive today uses in quite the same way. Quetzalcoatlus, according to this model, would start on all four limbs, building up speed the same way a sprinter builds up speed before a jump. Then, in a single explosive motion, it would push off using both its powerful hind legs and, critically, its massive forelimbs, essentially vaulting its entire body weight into the air in one violent launch, unfolding its wings and beginning to flap almost immediately to convert that initial burst of force into sustained lift. It's a launch method more like a gymnast's vault than anything resembling how a bird takes off from a branch. Once airborne, though, Chatterjee's research suggests Quetzalcoatlus was in its element. Estimates from his models put its cruising altitude at somewhere between 3,000 and 4,500 meters, and its top speed potentially reaching over 80 miles per hour, with some estimates pushing even higher, comparable to a small aircraft cruising at speed. At that altitude and that velocity, very little on the ground below would have had any realistic chance of spotting the danger in time, let alone escaping it. A shadow crossing the ground at that speed would have been the only warning anything got. It's worth pointing out just how counterintuitive this entire launch sequence really is, compared to how flight normally works in the animal kingdom. A bird taking off from a branch or the ground relies almost entirely on its legs and wings working together in a fairly gentle, gradual sequence. What Chatterjee's model describes is closer to a violent full-body launch, more explosive push than gentle liftoff, using muscle groups more commonly associated with pouncing or leaping than with flying. It's the kind of launch mechanism that simply doesn't exist anywhere in the modern animal kingdom, largely because nothing alive today needs to solve the specific problem of getting several hundred pounds of body weight into sustained flight using arms that also happen to be wings. Quetzalcoatlus essentially had to reinvent takeoff itself, because the ordinary rules of flying animals simply didn't scale up to something its size. There's also something almost unexpectedly cozy hiding inside this story, buried in the fossil evidence itself. Pterosaur fossils, including specimens closely related to Quetzalcoatlus, have preserved traces of fine, hair-like filaments covering the body, called pycnofibers. That kind of insulating covering strongly suggests these animals were warm-blooded, generating and regulating their own internal body heat the way birds and mammals do today, rather than depending entirely on their environment for warmth the way most modern reptiles do. Combined with evidence that pterosaurs laid eggs, the overall picture is of an animal that biologically straddled a strange middle ground, reptilian in ancestry but warm-blooded, insulated, and active, more like an oversized, flying, prehistoric bird than a typical cold-blooded reptile from the era. Even the brain fits the picture of something built specifically to master flight. Fossil skull scans have revealed that Quetzalcoatlus possessed unusually large regions of the brain associated with balance and motor control, the exact areas you'd expect to be enlarged in an animal that needed to precisely coordinate an enormous, thin-membraned wingspan through constant shifts in wind, altitude, and terrain. Managing a wingspan that size in flight isn't a passive activity. It demands exactly the kind of active, sustained neurological control that fossil evidence suggests this animal actually had. Eventually, though, none of it was enough. Quetzalcoatlus and the rest of the pterosaurs went extinct in the same mass extinction event that ended the age of dinosaurs, roughly 66 million years ago. For a long time, the exact timing of that extinction relative to the asteroid impact itself remained genuinely unclear among researchers, an odd persistent gap in an otherwise well-studied event. Some argued pterosaurs had already been in decline well before the impact, quietly losing ground to increasingly diverse and competitive early birds. Others argued the group was still thriving right up until the very last moment, and that the asteroid alone was responsible for wiping them out. More recent fossil evidence out of Morocco has helped settle at least part of that debate, suggesting pterosaurs were still actively diversifying right up until the very end, and that some species may have technically survived the initial impact itself, only to be finished off shortly after by the collapsing climate and food chains that followed. Paleontologist Brian Andres, who worked on that research, has pointed out that the real scientific disagreement was never about whether pterosaurs and dinosaurs went extinct at the same broad moment in Earth's history. It was about whether pterosaurs died out slightly before or slightly after the asteroid itself struck, a distinction that sounds small, but matters enormously for understanding exactly how that extinction event unfolded, species by species, across the entire planet. Interestingly, by that final stretch of the Cretaceous, some pterosaur species appear to have been shrinking, evolving wingspans of just a meter or two, a dramatic reduction that some researchers interpret as a genuine attempt to adapt to a rapidly deteriorating world. Paleontologist Elizabeth Martin Silverstone has described this as a kind of last-ditch evolutionary effort, animals visibly trying to shrink their way into survival as their environment collapsed around them. It simply wasn't enough, or didn't happen fast enough. Unlike the small, feathered dinosaurs that eventually became modern birds, No pterosaur lineage made it through to the other side of that extinction event, no matter how small some of them had managed to become by the very end. Whatever advantage true birds had in that final crisis, size alone couldn't buy the pterosaurs the same second chance. So, pulling this all together, Quetzalcoatlus wasn't a gentle, harmless glider waiting patiently for something else to die first. It was a giraffe-sized fighter jet-wing predator that hunted primarily on foot, armed with a toothless but genuinely formidable spear of a beak, capable of launching its own enormous body into the sky using raw muscular force, then cruising at aircraft-like speeds high above a landscape that had very little warning before it struck. Warm-blooded, insulated, and neurologically built for precise flight control, it occupied a genuinely unique position in the late Cretaceous world, one where even a young tyrannosaur, not yet grown into the monster it was destined to become, may have had real reason to watch the sky. It's a strange thing to sit with. An animal most people have never heard of, sharing a timeline with the most famous predator in history, and quite possibly outranking it, at least for a portion of that predator's life. The Age of Dinosaurs was never just a story about what happened on the ground. If this was interesting, hit like and subscribe for more deep dives into prehistoric predators. And drop a comment, what part of Quetzalcoatlus surprised you the most? Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next one.